a sense of one of the reasons why I chose Louis Pasteur as a scientific model of greatness. And it's very personal for me because my paternal grandmother and grandfather emigrated from French Quebec to Syracuse, New York, and they brought their 12 children with them. And within a period of 1 week, 7 of those children died of diphtheria. And I know other people know stories like that, but the only boy that survived, there were 4 girls and the boy, was my father's dad. And, you know, when you think about it, I mean, it was described to me, you know, they had coffins laid out in the parlor. When you think about that, it really blows you away. But this is exactly what could happen, what's going to happen if we don't stop this oligarchy now. Now, Louis Pasteur, I'm going to start backwards a little bit and then go forwards. When he was elected to the French Academy, he had the following to say, which I think is very good. He said, "My philosophy comes from the heart and not from the intellect, and I adhere to that which is inspired by the natural, eternal sentiments one feels at the sickbed of a beloved child breathing his last. In that supreme moment, something deep in our soul tells us that the universe is more than an arrangement of certain compounds in a mechanical equilibrium, arisen from the chaos of elements by a gradual natural forces." And I wanted to share that with you, because what he means is he's talking about the idea of the soul as the idea of your mind. The difference between your brain and your mind are 2 different ideas, actually. Now, Louis Pasteur, I want to show, I have a slideshow here. His grandson, Pasteur Valery Rideau, who wrote this book on his grandfather, said a man of genius was needed to bring light in all this darkness. He was to be Pasteur. This man had the rare gift of insight. You will grant, ladies and gentlemen, that there are 2 ways for the human mind to gain knowledge: reason and imagination. In the modern world dominated by technology, we are so accustomed to rational progress that we have come to hold imagination in too small esteem. And yet without it, there could never be great inventors, any more than there could be great writers and great artists. Imagination in the scientific genius assumes a special form of insight. This is the sudden intuition of the truth without the interposition of reasoning. Insight is what makes scientists of genius foresee the end to be achieved. What contradictory qualities he must possess. Besides the gift of observation, he must be endowed with imagination, so he must be a poet. He must not be narrowly specialized. His knowledge must range over very wide fields. He must discipline himself to assiduous art labor, and he must confine himself within the bounds of rigorous experiment, requiring him to bridle his imagination. Can I see the next one? This is young Louis Pasteur, and this is the year before. He's born in December 27th, 1922. So this would make him 23 years old. 2 years later, in 1848, 1847, 1848, he made his first big breakthrough on on crystals. Roger and I gave a presentation on that class about a month ago. And I'm not going to go through it again now because there's so much more that Pasteur had to do that he did. Now, his father was a tanner and he had 4 sisters, and his parents went way out of their way to make sure that Louis got an education, and they spent the limited resources they had to send him to school and to college. So what he used to love to do was paint. That was how he let his creativity come out, was through his painting. And it turns out that years later, he was asked to be the chairman of the Fine Arts Department at the École Normale. And he would go to the Louvre and he would study the great masters, and then he would teach. He would have people actually paint. He would teach them, how to use pigments, how to use secatives, these ideas. So this is one of the sides of his creativity, was through painting. By Einstein, it was music. It was his violin. But Pasteur, it was art. Now, one of the first things that he is famous for doing is discovering the process of fermentation. Before Louis Pasteur, people believed, scientists believed, that fermentation was just a chemical process, that you had fermentation in vats of grapes, and that was just a chemical process whereby the grapes would be turned into wine or into vinegar. Louis Pasteur was asked when he was a young professor, he was 30 years old, and he was 32 years old. He was dean at a college at the age of 32. What he did is he was asked by the father of one of his students who was a big industrialist, and this man had a beetroot juice factory, and he kept getting bad beetroot juice. It would go rancid on him, and he didn't understand why. So Louis went to the plant, and he brought his microscope, and no one had ever seen a microscope before. And he simply, took, swaths of the beetroot juice, and he looked there, and what he saw was yeast. And they were all moving. So this next one, you see the yeast. No, that's beer vat. You don't see that very well, but this is yeast in beer where it's bubbling up. But he maintained that ferments are a living process, and it starts with a microbe. And he was attacked for this idea through his whole life, that he should say that, even though he proved it. So, from the idea of ferments, well, what he did basically is he would heat wine to about 103 degrees and kill the bacteria. And the same thing he did with beer. And of course, he's famous for pasteurizing milk. And the milk thing was very important because 100,000 children in the Western Hemisphere would die every summer of bad milk fever. Abraham Lincoln's mother died of it. So, anyways, he moves from the idea of ferments, where he's contemplating this thing about the microbe and the living process that he sees going on in fermentation. And he's fixed on this idea of what is life. that these things are not just a chemical process, these are life processes. So, France was losing 10 million francs a year due to bad wine and beer, and he saved the industry, and they were able to ship wine and beer all the way to India, and it'd be perfectly fine. So he saved France 10 million francs. Then what happened is, I'm skipping parts of his life because I want to cover as much as I can. He received a communication from the Minister of Agriculture of France, because 3,600 mayors of small towns throughout the provinces of France said that the silkworm industry was dying, had been dying for the last 15 years. And silkworms was in the hundreds of millions of francs. So he was asked, they went to the emperor, and they asked the emperor to choose somebody to tackle this problem on silkworms. So they went to Pasteur. And Pasteur had never seen a silkworm in his whole life. Had no idea, you want to read that quote? Had no idea of what it looked like, nothing. And what happened was he had the following conversation with one of the scientists in that area.
He stopped to visit with this entomologist on his way there, and as reported by Fabre, the entomologist, he handed Pasteur a cocoon, as you see here, and Louis very gingerly held it, shook it, and put it close to his ear, and exclaimed with surprise, "A kind of knocking sound. Is there something inside?" "Yes, indeed." "What can it be?" "The chrysalis." "What do you mean, the chrysalis?" "I mean the sort of mummy which the caterpillar changes into before it becomes a moth." "And there's one of those things inside every cocoon?" "But of course, it's to protect the chrysalis that the worm spins the cocoon." "Ah," replied Pasteur. That's how much he knew.
That's what he knew
about silkworms when he was appointed as the scientist to attempt to save the entire silkworm industry.
Right. So what he did, he always did this. When he had to solve a problem, he would go to the people who knew something about it. So he went to the farmers that raised the silkworms, and the whole industry was called sericulture. So he went and talked to the main people there, and he went inside the nurseries of the silkworms, and he was learning exactly how this thing worked. It took him 6 years. In between, he was doing a million other things, because you only harvest silkworms at certain periods of the year. But he discovered a disease, and the disease was basically, it was due to poor lighting, dirty and crowded of the silkworms, crowded silkworms, poor ventilation, and basically if you had that with people, you'd get the plague. So one of the first things he did is he went about and ordered everything to be cleaned and disinfected, and then he began his work. And he had his microscope with him and his 8-year-old daughter, Marie-Louise, and Louis would invite the farmers in to see what he could see in the microscope, and he would say, "My little daughter can identify to you what this is like, so don't be afraid. You can know this." Now, it's still so okay, these are Seeds.
They're the eggs.
Eggs.
So for moths, you said?
Yeah. The moth lays these tiny eggs that look like seeds. That's what they refer to them as. Those seeds grow into the caterpillar.
Which is a silkworm?
Yeah, they call that the silkworm. And at a certain point in its life cycle, it begins to spin silk to form a cocoon, and then the caterpillar metamorphosizes into a moth again to continue the process, and the cocoons are harvested and boiled to produce silk thread. That's where all the silk comes from to make blouses and things like that.
So, just checking my notes here. Okay. I'm going to go to spontaneous generation. There was a big fight that went on for years and years and years. It was on the idea of spontaneous generation. And what that is that it's a belief that life comes from non-life. That, you know, one guy in the Middle Ages said, you know, if you put some old corn and dirty rags in the corner, mice will grow out of it. Or if you go to the marshes and the swamps, and the emanations that rise from the swamp bring forth frogs and leeches and snakes. So there was this idea, this magical idea, no idea of a life cycle or anything like that, that life came from non-life. It was also the idea that if you had a disease, that you didn't catch the disease, that the disease was already in you, waiting to come out. Like Aristotle said, every dry body, when moist, breeds life, and every dry and every moist body breeds life. Virgil believed that life emanated from putrefying entrails of young bulls. Now, the first scientist in the modern period, I guess it was during the Italian Renaissance, proved that this wasn't true. What you're seeing here is maggots on meat. And of course what they said is that the maggots were inside of the meat and that they sprang from the meat. Francesco Redi, what he did is he put a netting over the meat so that nothing could get through, so the flies couldn't attack it and lay their eggs. So that's just a disgusting picture of maggots. Okay, now on spontaneous generation, he had this big fight with this other scientist who was the head of the French Museum of Natural History. His name was Pouchet. And Pouchet was a big promoter of spontaneous generation, and Pasteur challenged him. And basically, the scientists who were his mentors begged Pasteur not to do this. They said, it's harder to prove that something doesn't exist than the opposite. You should not get into this fight. But he went into the fight anyway. What they did is they had, this is an invention of Louis Pasteur's. It's called the swan neck flask. And what he did is he had water, yeast, and sugar, okay, which was teeming with life, and he heated it to kill it. He created this flask so that no air could go in, that the air would be stopped. Show another picture of the flask. That's a microscope. Oh, okay, go back to the flask. That's his microscope.
Oh, There should be one after the microscope.
Yeah,
Oh, that.
yeah. So what Boucher did is he didn't use sugar and yeast, he used hay. And he boiled the hay, and it was all teeming full of life. It had germs. And he said that this is, that I'm right, that these germs came even though, I heated the flask, you still get germs. And Louis Pasteur said, there are spores in that hay. So you think you're killing them all, but you're not. You have to, up the temperature considerably to kill the spores. So anyways, what he did is he sterilized it, and it would be sterile for years if he wanted it. And all you had to do was break it, and then it would be teeming full of life again. So he was using this as proof that ferments and the germs come out from outside, and they're not inherent, from non-life. So, this was a fight that he waged for a long, long time. And he made a lot of enemies when he did this. Now, when he was about 40, he was elected to the Academy of Science. He was up for election twice before, and he was voted down, and this time he squeaked in. Even though he was known nationally, he had done all this work on crystals, he had done all this work on ferments, he saved the milk industry, the wine, the beer, the silkworms. They wouldn't elect him to the Academy of Science until he was about 40 years old. So his polemical style used to upset his enemies. Now, say likely. So at this time, he's still working on silkworms. He's still working with spontaneous generation. And then he has a stroke when he's 46 years old, and the whole left side of his body is, well, he can't move anything but his thumb, and he has to drag his foot. And he spent the rest of his life that way. He suffered 2 more strokes, and a lot of it was just, the amount of work he was doing, and the fact that he had so many enemies that he had to constantly, shoot them down. And this was enough stress, and eventually killed him. Now, in 1870, 2 years after his stroke, was the Franco-Prussian War, which devastated France. The Germans invaded, and they won the war. And what they did is they made France pay reparations of 500 billion francs, and they seized Alsace-Lorraine. And it is said that with all the discoveries of Pasteur, and you'll see by the end of it, that Pasteur had contributed to France all of that money, 500 billion francs. That's what his discoveries were worth. Now, in 1873, at 51, he was elected to the Academy of Medicine. What do we have up next, Paul?
With the microscope, you go right into the enzymes.
Oh, okay. Well, let me finish this part first.
This stuff is
Should put that stuff on now.
go into germ theory.
Okay. Show the list next one.
Go back, no, it's going backwards. Going backwards to Lister.
Lister.
Or backwards to the chart. Go back to the chart. That one.
There we go. This is a chart of puerperal fever. What it was is mothers who died in giving birth to children. And as you can see, it has the years 1841 to 1848. And basically, the death rate in Paris hospitals was about 25%. So you would be having your baby, and there would be a pretty good chance you were going to die, and the baby too. So one of the things Pasteur did was he stressed the idea of cleanliness all the time and sterilization. And this was a major breakthrough because doctors never looked in microscopes. They never saw germs. They'd be delivering a baby, and then they would go and do something else. And then they'd go back and maybe deliver another baby or go examine a corpse, and they'd never wash their hands. And when Pasteur took them on, they got angry. And they were angry from 1870 to 1882-83. It wasn't until about 1890 that this practice was gotten rid of entirely. But next is a picture of Lister. Joseph Lister, the founder of Listerine. Joseph Lister lived in Scotland, and what he did is he saved people through his sterilization processes. Instead of putting old bandages on somebody's wound, what he would do is he would insist on all new linen, clean, sterilized. And as a result, one of the things he did is he was able to save people who had compound fractures. Compound fractures is when your bone comes through your skin. And almost everyone who had a compound fracture would die of gangrene. And Lister saved 80 to 90% of them through his practices. And Lister wrote many papers, and he said in every one of his papers that the idea he got to do this came from Louis Pasteur. Now, where am I now?
Can I jump in and say something
Yeah.
about germ theory?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to elaborate on one aspect of this before we go forward, which is the whole idea of germ theory, which was being developed during this period, which was based on this idea that the cause of disease was some kind of infectious agent that would enter the body of an otherwise healthy person and result in some illness, sickness, disease, etc. And that we take that for granted. But at the time, this was hotly debated and rejected. And this is also the context for this debate around spontaneous generation. Because the counter-argument to the idea of germs causing a disease was that somehow these things were being produced within the body, almost like decomposition. And if you look at the debate around fermentation, there were people who said, well, it's a chemical reaction that the grape juice is simply decomposing. It's akin to death that winds up producing alcohol, as opposed to it being a living organism, a living process, which is breaking down the sugar to produce the energy needed for the life process and reproduction of the yeast, and that the alcohol was a byproduct of that living process. So in the same way with the whole question of disease, was most of the medical community was convinced that gangrene or anything else was being produced within the person's body. and therefore there were no infectious agents that you had to keep out of the body. And Louis Pasteur, he's only a chemist, remember. He's not a medical doctor. He has no degree in medicine. He is not a biologist in terms of having a degree and being certified as an expert in living processes. He's a chemist. And here he is going around and telling biologists, the entire medical community, well, you're all wrong. Okay? So that there was, I can, particularly in France, I don't know what it is about the French, but I can just see the reaction of the French. Who are you to tell us about what is causing disease? And so there was just a total hostile reaction, and in spite of, you saw that chart, in spite of the fact that you could have 20, 25, 30% of women dying in hospitals giving birth to a child, that these doctors would have this totally hostile reaction to the idea that you should boil your instruments, that you should not reuse bandages, that you should not, tend to a pregnant woman after you've just done an autopsy. But those were the conditions. And, these kind of advances, when we think about how the life expectancy has been increased for mankind, how the population has achieved 7 billion, that occurred because of the actions of individuals who fought to make that possible. That none of these, huh?
Now we got blown up.
Yeah, right. Right. Well, that's part of what's happened to our culture, where the growth of population is seen as a horrible thing. If only those people had died from disease, then they wouldn't be gobbling up all our resources, right? And that the standard of living, the life expectancy that that we generally enjoy or have up until now, might seem as though, well, it just sort of happened. But the only reason any of that happened was because of people like Pasteur, who fought day and night, year in and year out, to find out what is robbing people of a long and productive life, and how can we eliminate that. And so when you see these things and these battles that went on, it was only because of Pasteur's tenacity and the conviction that his method was correct that allowed these tremendous leaps forward to occur.
Thank you. Pasteur did receive some encouragement from some individuals. I want to read you a letter that was written by an English physician, John Tyndall. And he wrote to Pasteur and he said, "For the first time in history of science, we can entertain the certain and definite hope that inasmuch as contagious diseases are concerned, medicine will soon be freed of empiricism and placed on a solid scientific basis. When this day comes, mankind will, I am convinced, gladly acknowledge that it owes the largest share of gratitude to you." Now, okay, I think I'm going to anthrax. The anthrax bacteria. Pasteur was asked by the French government again to please solve the anthrax problem. What was happening is that they were losing sheep, they were losing cows, they were losing horses by the tens of thousands because of anthrax. And nobody knew what to do. So what Pasteur would do is he would go to a field where there were sheep grazing, and he'd say, "Now, what did you do with the sheep that died of anthrax?" "Oh, we buried them." "Buried them here?" "Yes, we buried them here." and he could see that in the dirt there were little holes where earthworms were burrowing, and the earthworms were taking up the spores of anthrax, so that when the sheep began to graze and cut their lip, the anthrax would enter the sheep and kill them. So Pasteur decided he wanted to stop the disease, and he came up with the idea of vaccination, of inoculation to prevent anthrax. And this is the first time, well, it's not the first time, but because you also have Jenner, who is Robert Jenner. Is that next down? Okay. Yeah. Okay. This is when Jenner was inoculating people with cowpox. It was found that milkmaids who worked in the dairy would not get smallpox. They would get a mild case of cowpox. Jenner noticed this, and what he did is he began using cowpox to inoculate people against a much worse disease of smallpox. And this is a cartoon against Jenner, where all these people turn into cows. But that, that's what it was like in that period. They would just, any scientific advancement and they go crazy. And there are some things like that that go on today, unfortunately. So what he does is he finds the anthrax germ, which I had shown you. He discovers it, isolates it, and then what he starts to do is he starts to cultivate it. And he renders it, he gets the disease in a jar, then he takes a drop, put it in another bottle, and from that put another bottle, and from that into another, and so on and so forth, so that he had a very, very weakened anthrax vaccine, which he tested and worked. Nobody believed him. There was a big fight in France. In fact, people took bets that this was not, that he was wrong. There was no way you could vaccinate sheep. He was attacked by everybody, including Robert Koch, who was the #1 scientist of Germany, who said vaccination would never work. So the next thing I have for you is a brief 5-6 minute video that I want to show you from the movie, The Story of Louis Pasteur, and this has to do with his experimentation on sheep. So I'm going to let Bob show that. It starts out with them talking, and Pasteur is very worried. He's not allowed to go where the experiments are being held. Those are the rules. And so he's expressing his anxiety to his wife.
Why don't you describe it?
You want me to describe this? Oh, okay. Before I start that, what happened was they decided to go to an area of France called Pouilly-le-Fort. And at this place, Pasteur brought 50 sheep. And 25 of them were not vaccinated, and 25 of them were vaccinated. And they had the very light strain of anthrax. And the idea would be that the following week, they would give the 25 sheep another dose, a higher dose of anthrax, while the 25 sheep that didn't have the anthrax virus remained the same. And this went on for several weeks. It took about a month to do this. And you'll see what happens. Basically, all of his sheep that he vaccinates live. And all of the test subjects who are finally vaccinated with anthrax all die.
The theory was that by giving a small dose of a weakened virus, or bacteria, I'm sorry, that by giving a weakened form of the anthrax bacteria to the sheep would stimulate a response within the sheep that would allow the body to fend off this attack. So by giving half of the sheep these low-dose vaccinations, that hopefully would give them some ability to withstand the full dose of anthrax that they were given at the end of the experiment, while the other group of sheep had not been vaccinated in this way. So by the third time, all the sheep got a full dose of anthrax, and the question was whether these sort of preparatory low-dose vaccinations would guard them in a way that the other sheep would not be protected.
Right. So this, what's going to happen is you're going to see, this is a reenactment, of course, but it's very funny and it's very true. People wrote about it. There was a carnival atmosphere, and people are taking bets. And some are betting on Rossignol, the man who said you can't possibly vaccinate and keep people, animals from anthrax. And people are voting or waging that Pasteur will win this. So this is that part of the
People
movie.
came from all over Europe. The media was there. It was a huge deal.
Try not to worry, Louis.
I should have stayed. I shouldn't have left them.
Who's there? Besides, Dr. Rossignol said it was against the rules.
Rules? What nonsense.
Louis, do you realize what this means? Tomorrow, if you're successful, every farmer in Europe will want your vaccine. You won't have a moment's peace, day or night.
The benefits of science are not for scientists, Marie. They're for humanity.
Our opponents are on their way.
Well, Rossignol or Pasteur, which is it going to be?
I say Rossignol. He's a member of the Academy.
I say Monsieur Pasteur will win. Please, one moment.
Well, they're having quite a call.
It's amazing. People have come from all over Europe.
To see the acrobats or the Punch and Judy show?
These rural entertainers are like fleas. The slightest crowd attracts them.
Thank you, monsieur.
Dr. Lister, one moment, please.
List? Well, well.
Dr. Lister from England?
The press would appreciate a statement. from you.
Lister, how extraordinary. What brings you here?
The same reason that brings you, my friends. How do you do? How do you do? Please.
I'm sorry, after you.
No, after you.
No, after you.
No, after you.
No, after you.
What?
No.
Monsieur. Dead.
Yes, Pasteur was right.
So far. Now let's see the ones he treated.
Oh, they won't die, eh?
You couldn't convince me.
They're all alive and healthy, as you predicted. Oh, my faithful friend.
Monsieur Pasteur, Monsieur Pasteur. Monsieur Pasteur is great. Monsieur Pasteur.
That's good news.
Let me shake your hand.
Father, I'm so happy. And I'm so proud, dear.
Annette!
Jean, isn't it wonderful?
At last, monsieur. A triumph.
For you too, my boy. Congratulations.
Father,
Yes.
Jean has something to ask you.
Well, let him ask.
Monsieur Pasteur, what I wanted to say was...
Yes.
Monsieur Pasteur, since my arrival at Arbois,
Mm-hmm.
I have come to know you and your family quite well. And, Monsieur Pasteur...
Yes, well.
Well, I feel,
Father, Jean is trying to ask you for my hand.
yes, we want to be married.
Well, I should hope so.
Congratulations.
It doesn't seem possible. How can they be alive?
I can't understand it either.
It's very easy to understand. Pasteur was right, and we were wrong. His vaccine does prevent anthrax.
We have a great man in our midst, a great man.
I quite agree.
I foresee marvelous benefits to the world, especially in the field of surgery.
Why not tell Pasteur yourself, Dr. Lister?
Oh, I'd be delighted to. I want to meet him.
Oh, here he is now. Pardon me.
Excuse me.
Look at those eyes, sparkling with health.
Pasteur, if I've been skeptical, I beg of you to forgive me. It's a miracle.
Thank you.
Dr. Lister, he wants to meet you. He's traveled all the way from England.
I feel it a great honor to be present.
The honor is mine, Doctor. I'm well acquainted with the work you're doing in antiseptics.
Thanks to you and your brilliant leadership. Such is fate.
Right after this part of the film, what happens is mad dogs start rushing in and everybody's screaming, rabies, rabies, rabies. And that's the next part of what Pasteur does. And he decided to do this on his own. He was not asked by anybody to cure rabies. This was something he wanted to do because when he was a young boy in Arbois, what happened was there was a wolf that bit about 5 men, and they all died horribly of rabies. Rabies is, I don't know if you're aware of it, it's called hydrophobia. And what it is it means you can't drink any water or anything for that matter. And the disease travels, it takes several months to kill you, but it basically travels up your spinal cord to your brain till you go mad and you're foaming at the mouth and you die. So when Louis saw this, when he was young, he wanted to do something about rabies. Now, the particular problem with rabies is that rabies is not a bacteria, it's a virus. And that presented a real problem because Louis could not find it. He couldn't find it in his microscope. And it wasn't until after World War II, with the invention of the electron microscope, that you could actually see viruses. So he had to do this. He had to figure out how to do this without having the germ. So what he did is he reasoned that the disease was hitting the brain, and he decided that he would take the brain matter and put this to a test. So he would have dogs. He'd put a hole in their head, take some of the brain matter, and then he would put the brain matter inside of a flask and dry it. And then he would infect a rabbit, infect a monkey, infect another monkey, infect a rabbit, and he did this from 1880 to 1885. He worked exclusively on rabies, till he got to the point where he had extremely weakened rabies. And with this, he began vaccinating dogs, and the dogs lived. They couldn't catch rabies. So if you're a dog lover, it's another reason to like Pasteur. So at any rate, they're not able to get rabies, but even more than that, Pasteur wanted to prevent people from getting rabies. He wanted to invent an inoculation technique, a vaccine, to prevent, is that if somebody was bitten by a rabid dog, he could save them. And, at one point, he wants to do this, and he writes a letter to a friend, and he says, I want to test this out, but, I'm afraid to. I'm not a doctor. I'm not supposed to be doing this. And the doctors who are under me, who work with me, I would be putting them at risk. If somebody died, we could be charged with murder. So Louis at one point says, I'm going to catch rabies. I'm going to let a dog bite me, and then I'm going to test my vaccine on myself. And his wife went hysterical. And so did the other doctors, and said, no, you're not doing this. And in July of...
I would just add, I think this is also an insight into Pasteur. They could not dissuade him by saying, you could die. That he was okay with that if it led to a discovery. The basis of their convincing him not to, let a rabid dog bite him was that if he did die, all of his work would be discredited. And therefore, he said, well, that's something I'm willing to live for, to see my research through.
Right. Right. It's a rabid dog, as you can see. Now, what happened is a young boy named Joseph Meister. Show a normal dog. Show a cute dog.
That's our dog.
Okay, next one. Yeah, this is spinal and brain matter in a flask with a solution that he's making to create the vaccine. Next one. This is Joseph Meister, very famous. July 4th, 1885. His mother comes to visit Pasteur, and she's frantic because Joseph has 14 dog bites in his face, his legs, his arms. He's practically killed by the dog. And everybody knew that Louis was doing experiments around this, so she took her son immediately to see Louis. And Louis was afraid to do it, but he was afraid not to. He said, if I don't do anything, this child is going to die. So he decided that he was going to use the vaccine and save the boy if he could. And he wasn't sure because it had never been tested on a human. He could do it with animals, but he didn't know if it worked the same way on man. So he went ahead, and there were a series of injections of a very low dose of rabies to a stronger one, to a stronger one. There were like 13 shots that were given over time. And he recovered. And Joseph Meister became one of Louis' favorite correspondents. He told Joseph he had to write him a letter every week. And here's the next one. These boys here were from Newark, New Jersey. And a wild dog came out and bit them all. You see the kid over there with his face bandaged up. And they have faces, they have bandages. He's got his arm bandaged.
That was in December of the same year.
1885.
Yeah.
The boys were all bitten and they were all doomed. And what happened is the New York Herald newspaper took up a quick subscription to ask people to send these boys to Louis in Paris. So within about 3 days, they raised the money and they shipped the kids off. And time was of the essence because, you know, you get there too late, you're going to die. You know, once it hits the spinal cord, you're finished. So we got them there. He cured out 4 of them, and that's Louis with them. What's the next one? This is the Institute Pasteur Institute. This was built in 1888, and it was built in response to what he did with rabies. Okay. He had a 70th birthday celebration, and people from all over Europe, the President of France was there, the Tsar of Russia was there. It was a huge birthday celebration in 1892. I have a quote. He was so touched he couldn't speak, so he asked his son to read what he had to say. And he said, "You delegates of foreign countries who have come a long way to show your sympathy for France have given me the greatest joy a man can feel who believes that science and peace will prevail over ignorance and war, that the nations will learn to understand each other, not for destruction but for advancement, and that the future belongs to those who have done most for suffering mankind." And then he said, "Young men, live in the serene peace of the laboratories and libraries. Ask yourself first, what have I done for my education? And as you gradually advance, what have I done for my country? Until the moment comes when you experience the tremendous gratification of knowing that in some measure you have contributed to the progress and welfare of mankind, more or less favored by the current of life as your efforts may be, you must have the right to say, on approaching the great goal, I have done all I could do." And what's the next one? This is one of the American boys who was bitten. And this is in the 1930s. They built a monument of Pasteur in Chicago, and he's at this celebration. This is the year of his death, 1895. He had had his 3rd stroke. He had to go for it. He was being constantly attacked, even in this period of his life. I want to read this because I think it's important. You won't get it unless I actually tell you. Okay, a doctor said, this is after he's succeeded in vaccinating people against rabies. And he said, and this doctor said, the alleged discoveries of Monsieur Pasteur, his heresies and frauds. And a newspaper said, the discoveries by Pasteur are nothing but a hoax, grafted upon the boldest lies. He cures rabies no more than silkworms. He is lying, and he has lied brazenly in all his scientific reports for the past 10 years. And then in another magazine, Pasteur was saying, they said about Pasteur, he's a deluded individual, a degraded chemist, an object of ridicule, whose frustrations should teach a lesson to those phony scientists who meddle into subjects they don't understand. So this was even said before he died. So he had a lot of enemies, sort of like LaRouche. And this is a few years earlier. I wanted to show it. It's my favorite picture because that's his grandson, Pasteur-Valerie Badeau, wrote the book I was citing from. And is that it?
Eugenics, yeah.
Want me to go fish?
Well, I'm just saying that's the only other.
You want me to? Okay.
That's to set the tone for the next class.
Yeah, I set the tone for the next class. What this is, I asked the question when we were writing this paper on Pasteur. What the heck happened? There were Pasteur Institutes that were built all over the world, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Hong Kong, in Africa and South America. The only places there were no Pasteur Institutes was the United States and Britain. Because all the money that was being spent on science was being spent on, well, one of the big things that was supported, is basically that you don't have the right to procreate. And it was a genocidal operation. It says here, I cannot read this sign, but what right have I children? Should the prisons and asylums be filled with my kind of children? I must drink alcohol to sustain life. Shall I transfer the craving to others? And I can't read this one here.
Because I'm a burden to myself and the state. Should I be allowed to propagate?
Right.
These were demonstrators. This was held on Wall Street. I don't know if they were bankers, but they were basically advocating race science. That people who had, whether they were alcoholics, they were considered mentally ill, whatever, or just poor, having the disease of poverty, that they should be sterilized. And that was done in America long before Hitler ever got the idea.
This is, they started doing this in 1900. The Rockefellers and the Carnegies and Avril Harriman's mother. Grandmother.
Oh. Harriman?
Yeah. I can't remember her name. She's involved in this. But all told, the Rockefellers gave the eugenics movement about $10 million for their phony race science. I'm going to stop there because that's a huge discussion that I would like to give it another time. So I'll take any.
That was David. David Rock's stuff.
No, John.
John. Oh,
David's
John.
father.